going to be talking really about sound, and there's a lot of material to cover today. It's all going to be about sound, and I'm hoping that if we can get through everything, that we'll actually get into a little bit of artificial intelligence at the end. And there, I'm going to try to do a survey at some point in Piazza because I want to show you some opportunities to do some AI coding with some examples, and I want to make sure that that everybody will be able to do that. Okay, I'm getting at least one person who can't hear. At least on my device, it looks like you have to select the audio there, either to dial in or call in via the audio device. So, oops, sorry about that. Hello? Okay. I got a message at least from one person that they can't hear. Can you confirm again that you are able to hear someone? And then I just want to make sure that someone's still listening.
Yeah, I still hear you.
Ve, hay alguien en la puerta. Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay. So, and then it says Roberto can't hear. So I'm just going to type a note here. I had to hit call audio in order to listen in. Let's call via device audio or dial in with the phone number. Okay, he can hear me. Okay, great. So the quote for today is, "Music is the universal language of mankind." When we get into sound, as we are today, we're going to go through how we hear sounds, and we're going to understand the different aspects of sounds that are important. Last time we talked about the frequency range. Today we'll talk about the dynamic range, which is related to how low a sound we can hear or how high a volume sound we can hear. Then we'll also talk about the volumes that we can hear at any particular frequency. And all that may sound technical, and I apologize if it does right now, but I think as we'll go through it, we'll understand why it makes sense, because it's not just the frequencies that we hear, it's our sensitivity to those frequencies that give us an appreciation for the sounds that we hear, even if the sounds are voice sounds or music sounds. And that'll be coming in handy as we transition to the artificial world today from the human world. Okay, so previously we decided we were going to start with this simple model that's on the right here. And we were going to do that because, one, because it's simple, and two, because it at least looks like it'll get us from quantifying an environment with sensors, generating sensor data, to parallel what we do as humans when we hear, and then extract features and represent that in a way that we can do machine learning and computing on it that parallels what we do as humans. Okay, and then we decided we talked about there being 5 types of things that we can sense, and those are either sensing things that have energy, um, like the electromagnetic spectrum, like light or X-rays, and then things that interact, like the forces of air that vibrate against our eardrum, um, and that sort of thing, or even biochemical interactions. When we make representations of this, that's what's our reality, and that's why we all have our different realities. And then we talked about the fact that humans actually only sense a very small part of what is sensible of reality. Some animals can do better in some circumstances, but what's fairly clear is that most animals have differences in terms of how they sense, and especially, as we'll see today, how they hear. Okay, so today we're going to cover human versus artificial sensing in the context of sound. We're going to talk about how we hear. We saw a short video at the end of the last class on how that is. Here we'll go through that again in the context of a drawing. And then we'll understand better about our frequency range, our dynamic range, that's how low or how high a volume you can hear at a given frequency, and then transition to artificial hearing. But the idea is seeing what we can do from an artificial standpoint and how we process that data to make sense of it. Okay, so there's basically three parts to the human ear. One is the outer part that we're all familiar with. Some of us pierce them and put earrings and whatnot down in this area or even in this area here. And that doesn't affect really our hearing as much, because what we're trying to do in our ears is collect vibrating air, and to do that it needs to come in through this direction here. You can see that with my cursor. So it comes in to the ear. We collect vibrating air that's vibrating at a variety of different frequencies. That vibrating air is channeled to this eardrum, which then vibrates. Okay, and that eardrum is going to vibrate a bunch of different frequencies at the same time, dependent upon the frequency content or the vibrational content of the sound of the air that's hitting it. When that happens, that air that's collected makes this move, which then makes these three little bones here move. And apparently, I understand that this one bone in here is presumably the smallest bone in the human body. So vibrating air makes a vibrating drum, which makes vibrating bones, which are then attached through a membrane to what's called the cochlea. And within this cochlea is contained a fluid. So now we move out of the air space or gas space into the fluid space. So this vibrating bone makes this membrane vibrate, which makes the fluid inside this cochlea vibrate. And inside the cochlea, there's a bunch of little hairs. And those hairs are essentially connected to your nervous system. And those hairs cause electrical pulses then to flow to your brain. Okay. And so all of this is really signal collection, signal processing, and conversion into electrical signals so that your brain can then start working its magic on it. Okay, so I'm going to try to play some sounds here, and I'm going to do this backwards because I know I can hear the last sound and I can't hear the first one. So I want to make sure that my mic is working when I play audio from my computer, that it's going into the sound. So I'm going to play the sound here, and I'd like for someone to tell me if they can hear it. Is anybody able to hear that?
Yeah, I heard it.
Okay. It's possible that not everybody can hear the sound, but this is a sound at a frequency that's very high. It's a C note for those of you that are musically oriented, and it's the highest C note that's within the auditory range that we have. So if you look at this blue arrow here on the left, that C note is close to the 20 kilohertz range, which means if we multiply that frequency by 2, it would be closer to 30 something kilohertz range, and humans can't hear those frequencies. So we're going to now go down in frequency, and each time we're going to go half frequency, though we're going to stay on the C note. Some people don't like that sound, by the way. I'll just kind of go through these, assuming that some of you can hear them. Is there anyone that did not hear that last one? Okay, we'll go down one more. I played that one again. I actually cannot hear that one. So was anybody able to hear that one?
Yeah, I heard the last one.
Okay. And there's one more, and this is going to get us now down pretty close to 20 hertz. Did anybody hear that one?
Yeah, I'm hearing.
Okay, so if you didn't, don't feel bad. It just means you're getting older. I can't hear the last two, and I'll explain why that happens to a lot of us a little bit later on in the presentation. But it's fairly common that as the human body ages, that it loses its ability to hear sounds at these frequencies, especially at modest volumes. But you'll see that at these frequencies around 20 hertz, even if you had really high volume, it would be hard to hear anyway. I'll show you that a little later. Okay. Okay, so that explains about dynamic range, meaning that if there are frequencies that are too low, we just simply cannot hear them. And if there are frequencies that are too high, we cannot hear them either. Now we're going to go into talking about dynamic ranges.
No, mute yourself.
Okay. So, and these slides are going to be maybe a little bit challenging to understand if you haven't seen them before. So I'm going to go through them slowly. Here we can start by looking at the red curve at the bottom. This is what's called the threshold of hearing. And if you look here on the left, it starts right around 20 hertz. By now you should be familiar with the fact that humans are hearing at the lower end of the frequency range starts at around 20 hertz. And then if you follow this red curve you can see along the x-axis or the frequency axis that it ends somewhere around 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. So that's the same information we talked about before that we can hear within those ranges. What's different here is we're looking at on the left axis now how intense the sound needs to be for us to hear it. Okay, so what that means is if we take a minimum here, if you look at the minimum of the red curve, that looks like it's somewhere around 3 kilohertz. What it means is that for us to hear a sound, a tone like the one we heard, that's vibrating the air at 3 kilohertz or 3,000 times per second, that's how fast the air is moving, that it has to have at least this intensity. And that's expressed in dB, which is a decibels, which is a unit of measurement of sound intensity. Normally this starts at 0 because that's sort of the baseline for where people can hear. But all of this in this range below 10 to 0 and to minus 10 is very, very subtle sounds that we can hear if we are in this sort of 1 to 3 kilohertz range of the sound. Now, if the sound has that exact same intensity, so it's just as loud, if you will, but it's over here at 20 or 30 hertz in this area, we're not going to be able to hear it. Because for us to hear a sound at 20 to 30 hertz that's vibrating at that frequency, it has to be many, many times louder. Okay, it has to be many, many times intense. And this is a dB scale, so every time you go up a tick mark here, basically, it's 10 times more intense. Doesn't mean it's 10 times louder necessarily. It's more like 2 times louder, but it's 10 times more intense. Okay, that means that if we actually played a song by combining sounds at different frequencies, but the intensity of the sound at each of the frequencies was the same, it would actually sound different to us because we would perceive the sounds at the different frequencies to be different. Okay, and so why is this important? This is important as it relates to our perception of the world around us, because what it says is that we are essentially changing what we are hearing so that things that are very intense at lower frequencies, or as you can see here, things that are more intense at higher frequencies, sound less intense to us. So we are more sensitive to sounds of certain frequencies, and we perceive different volumes for sounds having the same intensity. Feel free to chime in with questions. I realize there's a lot of information there. I'll go through one more example here. If you can see the little purple dot, which happens to be at 30 hertz and 80 hertz. Let me see if I can make this a little bit easier to do here. So the purple dots at the end of that line there. So that's at 80 dB of intensity at 30 hertz. That dot would sound very, very mild if you heard it. but it would sound just as mild, or if you will, just as intense as this red dot here, which is at 1 kilohertz, even though the intensity of that sound is 30 decibels, which is on the order of 100,000 times less intense. So here, something that's 100,000 times less intense would sound to us as having about the same volume. So it can be pretty dramatic, the effect that we have on our environment when we use sound to try to interpret reality. Okay, I'm going to move on. This will help, and the slides will be available so you can go back and look through some of this stuff. But this is the range that we have to listen to sound, which is a fairly big range of intensity. We can, at around 1 kilohertz is our biggest range, and around 1 kilohertz we can distinguish sounds from 0 dB and before our hearing breaks at around 120. You don't want sounds that loud, but basically we can distinguish sounds that are very, very faint in their intensity, and then going up to 1 trillion times louder, or a few 100 billion times louder. Although the volume that we perceive for that intensity of sound doesn't go up that dramatically. So if the intensity of the vibrations goes up 10 times, we only perceive that to be 2 times louder. So again, the point of this is that that there's essentially a filter or a change that we put onto sounds before we interpret those sounds. This goes back to the dynamic range I just mentioned. It's very important that if you decide you want to do these any experiments like this, that you recognize that you don't want to be at 120 dB, even though that's within the human range of hearing. That's also the beginning of what's called the irreversible damage regime, where the intensity of the sound is so large. Oh, someone has some background noise there. Okay, thanks. Okay, so okay. And then you can see that there's a danger range here. Yeah. And so some of you may have phones where you plug in a headset and it gives you a warning. That warning is essentially intended to try to help you stay out of this yellow and red zone when you're listening to music. Certain types of damage can be instantaneous. Other types of damage you'll be able to appreciate over time. Now the good news is that we can actually tolerate a lot of damage and still hear each other talk. And if you look here in terms of the sound range, you can see that a whisper at 40 dB, that intensity is actually fairly strong compared to the minimum intensity that you can hear. And that's good because to make sense of sound, you not only need to be able to hear it, but you need to be able to hear a multitude of frequencies of that sound. at whatever volumes they combine at to make the word or the sound that you're trying to hear. Normal voice is a bit higher there. When you get into significant background noise, something like a drill pounding into the pavement or an airplane taking off, those are the kind of noise levels that get you into this danger zone. Okay, this sound range is at a specific frequency. It's somewhere in the 1 to 2 kilohertz range. And you may recall, and you'll see here in the next slide, that the dynamic range, our ability to distinguish volume of sound or intensity of sound, varies as a function of frequency. Okay, so in this slide, we're looking at two things together. Again, this is frequency here on the bottom. By now you're familiar with the blue range here, which is infrasounds. Those are sounds we can't hear because the frequencies are too low. And then over here on this side to the right are the ultrasounds above 20 kilohertz, which are sounds we can't hear because the frequencies are too high. We just spent a few slides talking about sensitivity, how low we can go, and that's this bottom part of this eye-looking thing here that's indicated here as threshold. We talked about that if the that if the frequency of the sound is really low, then it has to have a fairly high intensity before we can hear it, because we have to be above this line. If the frequency is very high, it also has to have a higher intensity. Then if the frequencies are in this range, a little less than 1 kilohertz or up to 2 or 3 kilohertz, in which we hear very low volumes. If you look here, though, you can see that there's also an upper limit that varies on frequency. And when we were looking at the previous slide of where damage occurs, we said that was somewhere above 100 to 120. And that's only the case at 1 kilohertz. If you're down here at 20 hertz, the intensity of the sound that you can barely hear is about equal to the intensity of the sound that's too strong for you to distinguish when you're hearing. Okay, so that's what's called the perception limit. And again, that just means that you can't distinguish sounds that are more intense than that. Okay? So the reason that we can talk to each other and make sense of what we're saying, and the reason that we enjoy the music that we enjoy, is because those things, those sounds, and the volumes of the different frequencies that make up music and voice fall well within the dynamic range of our hearing. This is a really important point, at least as far as this class is concerned, because we need to be able to interpret sound, and we can interpret sound provided that we can interpret separately the different frequencies that make up the sound and the different intensities of the different frequencies that make up the sound. So this is what's called the auditory field, which is the combination of the lower threshold and the perception limit in between infrasound and ultrasound, and the conversation area, which is where we can hear things. I don't have one for music. If we did have one for music, it would also be a subset of the auditory field related to the conversation area. If some of you have more sophisticated sound systems in your homes or even in your cars, you'll have an equalizer, which allows you basically to take music and increase or decrease the volume of some frequencies over the volume of other frequencies. And so that gives you an idea of how things would sound differently dependent upon the intensity of the sound coming from different frequencies. In fact, if you play around, if you've got a big range of an ability to change the volume of different frequencies of your music, you'd be able to change it in a way that made the music not sound very well, right? So Javier put it here in the chat, very deep bass. Some music relies on very deep bass. We've talked about reggaeton before, but there's some hip hop rap tunes that rely on very, very strong bass. And if you take the bass away by reducing or even eliminating completely the volume of the lower frequencies in a song that's intended to be heard with bass, it's not going to sound very good. And the same is true if you start playing around with volumes of different frequencies of music and take them to different extremes beyond what the music was created, where the music was created to sound good. So human conversation takes place well within the frequency range that's heard. That's good. It means that when someone talks really loud, we can hear them. And if someone decides to talk very soft, like a whisper, we can still hear and understand them. The volume we can hear varies with frequency, and how high a volume we can distinguish also varies with frequency. There's a lot going on here. We're back to animals. For those of you who don't like animals, I apologize. But I think it's helpful in not only contrasting humans to artificial systems, but also humans to other animals. Here we have a collection of curves that are intended to show the minimum sensitivity of humans in comparison to animals. And this is experimental data, so you can actually see in some of these curves when we see the human sensitivities that they're not all exactly the same. So when we show human sensitivities, that's intended to be a norm or a typical, if you will, and not not yours. If you want to know yours, you'd have to be tested, right? I'm going to draw a line here, an arrow here pointing to what is the human one in this, if you can't distinguish the colors. So that's sort of this darker curve here that goes up right around 20 kilohertz, and then comes back here. In this particular case, it looks like it ends right around 30 hertz. If you recall, I couldn't hear things that were in the 40 hertz range. So if this was my curve, it would end somewhere down here. Younger people's curves tend to go a little bit further. Okay, so this is our curve here, and what I want to show you here in blue is what I've done is taken, and this is just approximate to give you an idea, I've taken the normal conversation range of humans, and that's the normal distribution of frequencies and the distribution of intensities, and represented it here with this blue oval. So now using my handy arrow, you can see here that most human conversation isn't anywhere near the 20 hertz limit, but it's actually closer to the 200 to 200 hertz on the minimum. So to make out what someone's saying normally, you'll do just fine if you can hear above 200 hertz. And then most of it, if you look over here, is sort of below the 4 kilohertz range, so 4,000 hertz range, even though our hearing goes all the way up to here. We're going to look at this also on the intensity axis, and I managed to get rid of my arrow over here. Okay, so the same thing here. Even though we can see or hear intensities below where we talk, and we can hear intensities above where we talk, most of our conversation is well within those bounds. Now, what I want to point out to you is that if you want to go to the zoo and talk to Mundi, you're not going to sound to Mundi like you sound to your friends. And because you can see here, this blue area where we normally speak actually goes below this red line, which is for an elephant. Now, I don't know if Mundi's from Asia or from Africa. Maybe one of you does. But the point here is that if you're speaking to an elephant that has this sensitivity profile, they're not going to understand you very well, even if they could speak and understand English, because it would be as if you took a sound of music and essentially cut off all of the high frequencies. So we can ask a question to make sure there's people still there. If you wanted music, or if you wanted your voice to be understood, or at least have the opportunity for Mundi to hear something that's closer to what you're hearing when you hear music, what do you have to do with the music?
Wouldn't you have to like bump up the frequencies? Like you have to redefine what bass sound is for us by just shifting our frequencies higher?
Yeah, you might have to redefine the music. And this is a question I'm not going to be able to answer because it would require me to be an elephant. But you certainly, you have to redefine, you have to change the content, its intensity and its frequency distribution, so that the elephant can distinguish the sounds well within its range. So let's show you what that could look like. Right, so we shifted. You could do this in two ways potentially. You could say, okay, I'm sorry, let me go back to the slide. You could say, okay, I'm just going to make everything louder. Right, so I'm going to take the same frequency and I'm just going to make everything louder. The problem with that approach is that now, just so that she could hear these frequencies, right? So she can hear the same frequencies that you're hearing. You've now forced her basically to hear things that are much louder than what she typically will hear at these frequencies. So another approach is to say, well, if what's comfortable to us is being having some range on both sides of what we're listening to, so that it's not anywhere close to the lowest frequency or it's not anywhere close to the highest frequency, and so that it's not anywhere close to the lowest volume and not anywhere close to the highest volume, then what you would actually do is sort of shift it, in the case of Mundi, to the left and to the right. And so now you can see in terms of where she can hear, right? The lower sounds, the bass sounds, are going to be, the same amount, if you will, above what her lowest threshold is. And here, if you look here, they're going to be roughly the same amount again as well for the frequencies where she can hear lower sounds. So the idea here is if you want to communicate to an elephant, or if you want the elephant to appreciate the same music you do, then you actually have to change the frequency. You have to shift the frequencies of the music to lower frequencies and raise their intensities. At least this would sound to Mundi similar to what the blue sounds to you. Now let's look at the case of the cat. If you look at the cat's actually on the lower end is somewhat similar. The cat, by the way, is this green one here. Okay, so at least on the lower end of the frequency spectrum, it's roughly the same, but they can hear and have excellent sensitivities at the lower end. So could you imagine being a cat? If you were a cat listening to reggaeton, it would actually probably be okay, because a lot of that's at least the bass part. But if you hear some of the songs where they have some choruses in really high-pitched tones, I forget what they call that, but there's a genre within reggaeton where there's a chorus line of very high-pitched voices. That would sound excruciatingly intense to a cat, right? Because basically those volumes at those frequencies would be well above what they're accustomed to hearing out in this range. So if you wanted your cat to be able to understand the words that you're saying, or at least be able to distinguish the words, whether they could comprehend their content, in order to preserve the spectral distribution and intensity, you would have to shift the volumes down and move the music or your voice to higher frequencies. So if there are any pet lovers out there, and I don't think this product exists, but if you made a microphone and put it through an amplifier and synthesizer and effectively shifted the frequencies up and lowered the volumes, the music should sound better to your cat, or at least it's going to sound to them more similar to them to how it sounds to you. Okay, so enough about cats, animals, humans, and that sort of thing. Let's go now to the artificial world. How do we collect sounds so that we can do any sort of intelligence on them? There's lots of different ways that we can do that, but typically what we want to do is convert the vibration of the air into electrical signals. Once we convert them into electrical signals, then we can do signal processing on them. We can digitize them. We can put them into a computer. We can do some more signal processing, and then we can start doing algorithms on them. But you can see from what we've shown so far is that there's a fundamental question, actually, in terms of how you want to gather this audio or sound information. When you're doing artificial intelligence, do you want to have your system hear the same way that a human does? Or do you want to give your artificial system superpowers and allow it to hear sounds that are at very low volumes, well outside the range that humans can hear, and make use of that information? So This is a speaker, I'm sorry, a microphone that was allegedly the microphone that was used to make the very first telephone call by Alexander Graham Bell. Like the ear, it has this upper ear section, which is a box with a hole in it. So I'll show you that. Okay, sound goes in through that hole there. It's captured by the box. At the bottom of this box, there's a diagram, and this is presumably the sketch that he made actually, of it. And this diaphragm is intended to be sort of like the eardrum in your ear. So it's supposed to vibrate at the variety of frequencies, and the more intense the sound, the more intense the vibration is. Connected to this to make Alexander's microphone is a wire, like a pin, like a conducting safety pin, if you will, or a needle. Sorry, maybe it's better. This needle moves up and down into a bath of acid. And the reason there's acid here is because acid has some baseline conductivity of electricity. So basically, the more this diaphragm moves down, the more the pin moves down into the acid. The more the pin moves into the acid, the more of the electrical surface area of the pin is in contact with the acid. So the resistance of this pin to acid goes down, and the less it's in contact, the more resistance there is. So if you apply a voltage across this, the more it's in contact, the more current will flow through your circuit, and the less it's in contact, the less current will flow. And so in this way, electrical signals are modulated. We're not going to get into speakers today, but in the context of a telephone, those electrical signals are amplified and transmitted across wires to another telephone device. And that's back in the old days. Obviously, this is not how telephony works today. What I just described there was an analog system where the voice isn't even stored anywhere, and we don't have a liquid acid in our microphones. But it's interesting to see when we talk about going to the artificial regime that at least when this was done well over 100 years ago, the technology that was put in place is not too different from the ear technology, right? We're vibrating air, it's being collected. We're vibrating a diaphragm that's connected to a pin that's vibrating. So you could think of the pins maybe like the bones in the inner ear. And this is the bottom part, the acid is effectively doing what the inner ear does, which is converting that, something that's going on in liquid to something that's going on electrically. If you have or have someone that you know that has a cochlear implant, this is sort of a combination of artificial hearing and real hearing. And there's a lot of different technologies out there today, but this is one that's fairly common. Here you put an electrical microphone outside of the ear, so you actually bypass the outer ear. You don't use the sound collection of the outer ear. Use a microphone, and we're going to talk about microphones in the next few slides, to convert the vibrational sounds into digitized sound. You then transmit that by a skin antenna to an internal implant that goes down into the cochlea. And here everything's electrical. So everything in a cochlear implant from a sensing standpoint is done outside, and it's electrical, and then the conversions go down a strand of electrodes, and those electrodes, where the electrodes that go off are a function of the frequency of the sound. So the sound is digitized, broken up into different frequencies, and that's used to stimulate the right parts of the cochlea, because some parts of the cochlea respond to higher frequencies and some parts of the cochlea respond to lower frequencies. Okay. So the microphones transform those vibrations into digital audio signals. Those digital audio signals are transmitted by radio frequencies to an internal implant, and those signals are then used to stimulate electrodes at different parts of the cochlea dependent upon the frequency and intensity of the sound. In both cases, in the human ear without the cochlear implants and the human ear with the cochlear implants, it's the connection between the cochlea and the hearing nerves that are being stimulated. So your brain, if given a cochlear implant, will learn how to figure out what frequencies are mapped to the new mapping, what frequencies of sounds are mapped to the new mapping of the electrical impulses that are sent up here to the brain. So that's a lot of information. I'm not seeing you in person to see if they're blank stares or not, so feel free to pause me there if you have any questions. If not, we'll keep going. Okay, so how do we, what do our microphones look like today? The answer is that there's a lot of different technologies that are used. In a cell phone today, you might have upwards of 4 microphones or more. I think the iPhone 6 or 7 had 4 microphones. They allow us to get more information about the environment around us. They also have different applications. Some microphones are intended to hear you speaking when you're making a phone call. Others of the microphones are tuned to hear you speaking when you're really far away from the phone. And you all are familiar with the Está bien Google message, and why I say that in Spanish. That's typically a different microphone than the microphone that's in use when you're actually talking to someone on the phone. It's tuned differently because it's trying to sense different things. So I'm going to go through 2 types of common microphones. One's called the capacitive MEMS microphone. MEMS stands for micro electromechanical microphone or system. Here, interestingly enough, there's still a diaphragm. The vibrating ear moves the diaphragm. In the picture here, that's this purple line here. That's the diaphragm. That vibrating diaphragm forms a back plate between a capacitor. And a capacitor is just 2 conducting electrodes separated by some space. So this thing here called the back plate, the separation of that back plate to the bottom diaphragm is going to vary dependent upon how much that diaphragm is displaced. So basically, the vibrating air causes the diaphragm to vibrate physically, and the varying distance of that diaphragm as it's vibrating to the back plate changes the capacitance. And that's what is read out in the electrical circuit. Here's a very different, well, not very different, but a different approach that's more popular now because it consumes less power. So in more recent Amazon Alexa devices, this is the device that you would find inside. It's what's called a piezoelectric MEMS device. Same concept again as in the human ear and as in Alexander Graham Bell's microphone. the vibrating air is going to move something, in this case, a plate. You can see those here in green. Attached to those green plates, shown here in black, are thin layers of what's called a piezoelectric film. As these green plates vibrate, it creates stress in the piezoelectric film, and a piezoelectric film under stress creates electric charge, and that again then can be read out by your circuit. To give you an idea of what these things look like, this is a piezoelectric microphone that would be found in more recent Alexa devices. You can see here each one of these tick marks on the ruler is a millimeter. So this device is on the order of 3 to 4 millimeters on one side, another 3 millimeters or so on the other dimension, and it's about 1 millimeter high. So the vibrating air is actually hitting that part there into the page. And causing it to move. Now, when the signals come out of there, they're going to go, this thing is on this board, which is very small as well. And this board then can be used to convert those signals into something that your phone or your computer can use. Okay, so we understand microphones. We understand whether it's the real live human microphone that is your ear, or it's an artificial microphone that is converting vibrational energy into electrical energy. I'm going to steal my arrow from this slide to move it to the next one. We talked about microphones being designed now not just to hear like a human hears, which is what you would want if you were making a phone call, but also for different applications. And one of them I talked about was what's called far-field communications. And there what you're trying to do is separate out voice from a lot of background sounds when the voice is coming from a distance that's far away from the telephone. So normally in a telephone, you want to pick up only what's the voices that are close to the microphone so you can hear the person talking over the background. But in a far-field application, you want to sort of tune the microphone to be sensitive to frequencies and volumes, not like a human is, but like the system needs to be to optimize the ability of the artificial intelligence to not only pick out when there is a human sound, but pick out what that human voice is saying. This is just a plot of what's called, it's a wait on sound mode. Basically, the microphone activates the circuits it's connected to only when the volume in the room is above a certain amount. And these are tests that are shown here that for a voice remote control, if you just have a regular battery and what looks like a remote control like Alexa in a regular living room, that device is supposed to be able to be used for up to 20 months, so a little over a year and a half, if the TV that's on in that room is on roughly 3 hours a day, and the volume's above this threshold volume. And that's the threshold volume that's set when the system, the remote, hears something that it thinks might be a human telling it that it wants to change the channel or it wants to change the volume or whatever it is. Okay, so that's why this kind of microphone, even though it's not the kind of microphone set up in a way that you'd want to use it to talk to someone on the phone, is the kind of microphone that's set up to hear a human well when they're at a distance from the microphone and there's background noise. Okay. Whew. I feel like we've gone through a lot of material. Now we're going to get to what do we do with all this? Well, there's a lot that we can do with all this. I'm going to put a poll up either later today or in the next few days on Piazza, because I want to get an understanding of the group's comfort level in working with Python and some of the Python libraries. I know one of the requisites for the course was Intro to Programming 3011, and I don't want to turn this into an advanced programming course, but there are some things that we'll be able to do if a majority of the class has some comfort level with working with Python. So, I'm going to put a poll up, and now I'm going to transition into an example in a few minutes here, where if you are comfortable with working with those types of examples, we can do a little bit more as we go through the course. These are just this is not a complete list, but there's a whole host of applications that are of interest to those interested in artificial intelligence. These are some examples. Voice-machine communications is what I just talked about, where you might have an Alexa remote and you want to talk to that remote. In that case, you want the remote itself, which is the machine, to understand what you're saying so that you can instruct it to what you want it to do. Okay, so artificial intelligence is useful there in terms of hearing sounds, distinguishing voice from background sounds. That's one application within that application. Another is then analyzing the voice sounds to interpret what the words might be. And then the next one is taking those words and trying to map those words to what commands the remote actually is programmed to do. That might bring some parallels to Sophia, if you remember Sophia, in terms of trying to figure out what to do with what you think you're hearing or seeing. Audio fingerprinting is basically where you hear someone's voice, and you try to use artificial intelligence to determine with high confidence that the voice you're hearing is of that person and not of someone else, for security applications, for example. Audio classification or labeling is where you hear music and you might want to take that music and label it by genre. You might want to identify the singers that are in the music. You might want to identify the beat of the music. Now, for all these examples, there are non-AI ways of doing it, but these are areas where if you look in the literature, you'll find active research of people applying AI to see if they can bring some advantages to these systems that incorporate these applications. Voice to text, I use that quite a bit when I want to chat with someone by text, but I'd rather speak it than type it in. Audio source separation, that's where you take a complex audio file, if you will, and try to separate out individually all the speakers that are there, so you could create a different audio file that has only one speaker if there's 3 or 4 speakers in a conversation, and you could potentially create a different audio file for each of the 4 speakers. You could also use that to create karaoke soundtracks, where you want to separate out the background music from the voice. Audio search is just that. If you have some music that you like and you want to see if there's other music that's similar to it, or if maybe you want to see if someone's copied your music, you can do an audio search to see what music is similar to your music. Music transcription is literally taking the what the words are, keeping the timing that's in music that are being sung, and then putting that into text. Voice language translation is, there's two AI applications there. One is understanding what the voice is so that you can convert it to the right words, and then understanding what the words are in one language, what those words are trying to communicate, so that you can communicate or create a phrase in another language, and then use that phrase to create voice in that language. Music recommendation is a little bit different. It's more about understanding what's common about the music that you like. Again, using artificial intelligence then to recommend music based on what other people like. And I'm simplifying these, but these are all areas where you can apply artificial intelligence. In some cases, to do what a human can do, to pick out certain sounds. In other cases, to do things that humans can't do. Right? Not all humans can identify a voice on the telephone unless the person has a particularly distinctive voice. Not all humans can do a good job of picking out what people are singing in a song. And so in some of these cases, the current state of the art is that artificial intelligence is struggling to do as well as humans. In other cases, like voice translation, it's actually doing a much better job than most humans can do in translating from one language to another based on hearing someone. Okay, there's an audio classification example that we're going to walk through, and then I'm going to give you a link here. And that's what I'm going to encourage, what I need you to, after class, that's going to be the required reading. And the required reading is really just for you to read through that web page and some of the links there so that you can answer the poll question, which is going to be related to how comfortable you are with working with some of those examples. There was a question about audio classification and labeling about that example. That's what we're going to actually walk through right now, and that's determining aspects of the audio. Okay, and it could be, is there a violin in the sound that we're hearing? Or it could be, is this one of the singers within that sound? Okay, so this example is located at this link, and it's called Getting Started with Audio Data Analysis Using Deep Learning. Basically, there's a few steps that we need to go through. First, we need to take that analog electrical signal and convert it into digital signal. And we do that by running it into an analog to digital converter, which effectively creates data. And this is the kind of data that you're familiar with in computers, where we have multiple bits that represent intensity of sound at a given time. And so music or sound in a computer is just a bunch of bits at a bunch of points in time that relate to intensity. Now, how those bits vary in intensity and at what frequencies they vary in intensity, that, as we talked about before, the human ear working together with the human brain can tell if it's someone that's speaking, or if it's music, or if it's a drill, or if it's a siren, or something like that. So in this example that you'll see at this link, there's a variety of different types of sounds. And those sounds sound like this. Hopefully you can hear some of these sounds. Does anybody know what that sound is? Yeah,
Sounds like a gun.
that's exactly what it is. We'll do another one here.
Yeah. It's a car. It's a car
Yep,
honking.
that's the last.
It's just a siren.
That's a siren. Okay, excellent. So what this example does, and I'm going to go to the link now, which is the web page that I want you to go to as you're reading. Is it walks through this example. So you can actually reproduce what they're doing here. And if you look here, there are 8,732 sounds. And I downloaded them and worked through this exercise. They are wave files, so .wav, of 4 seconds or less. And these 8,732 sounds are of either an air conditioner, a car horn, children playing, a dog barking, drilling, an engine idling, gunshot, jackhammer, siren, or street music. Okay, and I just played for you a few of those examples. But what you're able to do here, and you can see that's where the last couple slides came from, is you're able to take this data, you're able to take all these sound files and do some signal processing on them with Python libraries that are available. And with those Python libraries, and there's really just two that you need. Well, there's some others, but the two main ones. One of them is related to audio processing, where you can extract the features from that, like how much sound is at certain frequencies. And then the other one is related to using those features to train an artificial neural network to see how good a job it does at predicting that for new sounds. So you save some of these 8,732 sounds. Maybe you train with 6,000 sounds, and you test on 2,000 sounds to see how well it does, depending on the variance of the network you use, in terms of predicting correctly whether a certain sound is a dog bark or a gunshot. That's pretty much what I had today. So, but to make it clear, I'll try to write it clear in the poll that we'll do in Piazza. But please let me know in that poll, if after you've reviewed this is the kind of, if you feel comfortable based on your knowledge that you could actually do some of these examples, or if you'd rather not. And if I find out that most of you feel comfortable, then we'll do more of this. And if I find that most of you are not, then we'll do less of it. And that's because I don't want you to we don't have TAs in this class to help, if you get stuck trying to get one of these libraries working, or if you're not even sure how to get a library working. So that's why I don't want to, to put things out here that are going to take away from what's really important that you take away from the class. On the other hand, if we can do some of these examples, they go a long way in helping us understand the connections between, the human ear and a trained artificial intelligence deep learning model. We can go from A all the way to Z. If not, we will review them like we are here without actually having to do any running of code. Hopefully that's clear. Is there any questions before we wrap up for today? Okay, Well, when I see you in person on Monday, we will see how this worked remotely. For me, it was a little hard just because I couldn't see your faces, so I had to assume that you were following. The homework's due tonight. If you have questions, put them on Piazza. The earlier you put them on, the more likely I am to answer you. I'll do my best, but I'm not going to be standing by the computer all night. So, and that's it. Any other questions at all whatsoever? If not, we'll wrap up. I'll assume the silent meaning we're wrapping up. And thanks a lot for your attention, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Monday, and I'll look forward to grading your homeworks after I get them tonight. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.